So, where is the climate money? I hope you all enjoyed that really simple animation that broke down a really complex theme into literally a couple of minutes and left you with a little smile as well and a big question. And I think that's what we're all about today. We are asking and simplifying things. And there's no simple answer to anything about climate change. And that's why we're really glad to have with us Dr. John Kitui. And Dr. John Kitui, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. We are counting on you, actually. We're counting on you to just, present the context, to simplify it. Just the context of resource allocation to communities, to climate finance. And I love the response when we reached out to you. And I think your response was, hang on, am I really a climate expert in that sense? And that's exactly why you're the perfect person to help us really understand and demystify some of these things. So welcome.
Thank you.
Maybe I could start by asking you a really simple question, and that is why? Why do we have to look at this through a social justice lens? What does that even mean? Like, why?
So I think overall it's been agreed that the people who've caused climate change are not people who are suffering the consequences. African countries and all developing countries in the South are suffering the consequences of climate change that has been caused by gas emissions or companies that are emitting greenhouse gases in other countries. So the social justice element there has been the people who've caused a lot of harm on climate should be able to support the adaptation of the victims, especially communities who are facing droughts, or who just are not able to harvest things as they've done before. So that's kind of the overall social justice element. There's an element where in Paris they agreed, for example, that by 2020 they will be raising about $100 billion to go towards climate finance.
100 billion?
Yes.
It sounds like a lot.
It sounds like a lot, but it was meant to go support, from a social justice perspective, people who are suffering the impact from an adaptation perspective to be able to adapt to climate change in the South.
But there's just a lot of gaps in this. It sounds really easy the way, I feel like, why not? Okay, I think that there are countries that have the money, that caused much of this, there are countries that don't. Why can't it just happen? What are the gaps? What are the things stopping it happen? Why isn't finance flowing the way that we'd easily expect it to flow?
So there are many reasons. So when you look at, OXFAM has published a report on climate finance, shadow report in 2020 that looked at how much of that $100 billion has been raised. And in 2017-2018, it's only 59.9 billion that have been reported by the developed countries to have been mobilized towards the 100 billion financing. But the global climate financing is very complex, and it's become overly complex because of the mechanisms and everything else. And because of that complexity, we end up with, from a complex perspective, what you can call wicked problems. So there's a lot of accounting problems, there's a lot of misreporting. When you look at the OXFAM's report, it shows like out of the 59.5 billion, probably actually about 19 to 22.5 billion is actually the money that is coming south. When you discount the interest rates that are charged on concessional loans, for example, when you look at the amount of climate financing that is tagged on other projects, so you can do a coal power plant and then put in there some mitigation and charge 50% of that money towards climate financing. So there is a lot of games that are being played, and that money is not flowing to where it is needed. And the little that is coming is not actually reaching the communities in the first place. So we could say probably from the global level it comes to national level, but how much of that is actually going to smallholder farmers to finance adaptation to climate change? How much of that is going towards reforestation and rehabilitation of degraded forest? How much of that is going to finance greening of energy, greening of transport, greening of livelihoods, greening of transportation, like, so for example, roads and everything else? So that money is not trickling down to where it is needed the most. And those, I think that for me, that's the biggest challenge that the global climate financing faces.
Whoa, and I mean, I can imagine it because there are all these, when you talk about the accounting and the taxes that's the kind of thing that I think almost makes these climate conversations difficult to even enter or put a toe into. But the way you've explained it really breaks it down and clarifies why, despite asking where the climate money is, it's not even an easy question to answer, right?
It is not, and partly because also of the lack of transparency on the finance flows or the cash flow itself. So, for example, there's a lot of reporting both within the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, but also there are mechanisms, for example, bilateral between governments in the north and in the south of climate flows, but there's lack of accountability. So the OXFAM shadow report on climate finance, for example, indicated that out of the $59.5 billion that was reported as climate finance, about 40% comes as non-concessional loans. We don't know what interest, we don't know where they're going, we don't know how much interest is charged onto that. Only about 20% goes out as grants to countries and goes out as grants down to community level or to investors in greening technologies, for example. So the lack of transparency itself also makes it very, very difficult to track where the climate financing also goes. But also on the reporting element, on what donors are reporting to, contributing towards, there's also a lot of lack of detail on what really constitutes climate financing itself. So there's a lot of what is called climate financing that does not constitute climate financing. So climate financing is supposed to go towards either climate mitigation or climate adaptation work. So if you want to shift from non-renewable energy to more renewable energy, those are some of the things that it's supposed to be financing. But there are funds that are reported as climate finance that are actually financing climate-harming interventions. So we call it greenwashing interventions. So if you want to cut down forest and plant palm oil, you can actually call it regenerative agriculture. You can stamp the word sustainability on anything, or sustainability plastic production, and you will get climate financing and it will be labeled as climate financing, despite that being climate harming itself. And so with some of the reforms that have to happen is that what is actually attributed to climate financing has to actually be audited and be seen to be going towards more regenerative interventions or initiatives as opposed to just funding and greenwashing what has traditionally been very planet-harming human activity.
I think even before we do that deep dive onto the cost of, transforming green economy and greenwashing and so on, maybe I could also ask, because there seem to be a lot of historical factors as well. I don't want to always go back to colonialism, but surely things like, colonialism and race and all those things must perhaps also play a part in all of this?
Yeah, so I think the social injustice element is, it's when you look at Africa or other developing countries, and let's focus really on Africa. So it's been up 50 years, maybe 60 years of independence, and so we seem to have won the political self-rule, but a lot of economic activity that happens on the continent is really driven by Western economies. So you look at the extractive industry, for example, in many countries, the extractive industry contributes immensely to the harm on the climate, whether it's in the oil and gas, for example, and how many companies are exploring oil and gas, despite us knowing that it's climate harming. And most of these companies that are doing all this are Western countries. So we've really never decolonized our extractive industries. We've never really decolonized our agriculture. As Africans, we've always practiced regenerative agriculture. Our grandparents practiced regenerative agriculture, the concept of food forests, the concept of mixed cropping. But our agriculture is now dominated by companies that sell chemicals that are killing our ecologies. We have herbicides that are being promoted now. We are promoting monoculture that is completely anti-planet as well. And I think for me, we need to decolonize our agriculture a bit as well, in the sense that we have to shift away from monoculture, overuse of pesticides, overuse of herbicides and other chemicals that are causing all the ecocides that we're doing, the disappearance of our rich ecologies, and go back to more regenerative ways of farming, more use of food forest concepts. There's new methods like permaculture, for example. There is ways of growing that does not harm the planet and does not harm other forms of life on the planet. And I think for me that's very, very, very important. The other element that I think is very crucial for us to appreciate is the centrality of us as human beings vis-a-vis other lives. And I think it's centering man or centering human beings it's itself a problem, because we look at other lives as a means to our end,
right,
as a means to our becoming billionaires, as a means to our own economic enrichment, and that contributes to a lot of harm that we do to other people, but also to other forms of life. So human beings have to change to be more symbiotic in the way that we live, in the way that we produce, but equally in the way that we consume.
right. So there are all kinds of costs, to this.
Yes.
Right? There are costs that come with, adaptation and mitigation investments. Maybe you could expand a little bit more about the kind of costs.
So when we talk about climate financing, I think as I mentioned, we expect that climate financing will meet some of these costs, like I'm talking about mitigation and adaptation. And it's simple things like smallholder farmers who were used to planting every year that they would harvest, with the droughts that they're able to adapt to that as well. That requires resources. We are talking about shifting from renewable dirty energy to more clean energy. That requires resources to financing as well. We talk about moving to more active transport. As African countries will require resources, for example, to finance building roads that allow people to cycle. So in Kenya, we want to see many people cycling, but I think we've all seen people who've been killed on the roadside because there's just no cycling lanes, or even if they are cycling lanes, now
they
they are
start
dominated.
and then they don't take you to where you want to get to.
Exactly. Yeah. So all those costs needs to be funded, and some of this climate financing has to go towards that adaptation of our transport and our agriculture, and those communities have to have access to that as well. We have to think of alternative livelihoods that are not planet harming, and so the shift from the planet harming methods of production and consumption to more sustainable ways also require resources. But having said that, I think it's also important to say that there's also a behavioral element that does not actually require finance. So I think sometimes we can be so focused on finance that we miss out on some of the decisions we can make as human beings without resources.
Like maybe I don't want to walk to the shops.
Maybe
I don't want to cycle.
Exactly. You think that you have to drive to the next shopping mall. We don't need to. We can walk to some of these places. The use of plastic bottles as well. As human beings, you don't require any funds to stop, to just make a decision not to use single-use plastics, whether it's carry bags or water bottles, and shift towards glass, for example, or other methods of long, reusable plastics as opposed to single-use
I think
plastics.
what was really amazing as we talk about behavior, for as long as we can remember, we were also used to having our dozens of plastic bags after every round of shopping.
Yes.
And just like that, with the policy change, it was a little uncomfortable for a few days, and suddenly we were all used to not receiving dozens of plastic bags every time we went shopping.
Yeah, that's amazing, and I think that's the power of government, the coercive power of government to make people behave in a way that is more friendly to the planet. But the question is, why couldn't just people do it without the lobbying in place? For example, in countries where there are no laws against plastic, single-use plastics, why can't people just make a decision that I will not use single-use plastics themselves? So there's that social innovation that I think for me intrigues me as well, that people have to make a choice. Because sometimes we are focused on the planet being in danger. By the way, the planet is not in danger at all. If the planet heats up in a way that it cannot sustain life, it will continue being here as planet Earth. And the people themselves, we human beings, are the ones on trouble. If a cooking pot is on fire and you have a frog inside and it's eating, the frog should not worry that the cooking pot is on fire. The cooking pot is fine. We as human beings are the ones, if we don't adapt, if we don't change our ways of production, but also the consumption element. I think we'll end up in trouble. This planet, maybe in a million years again,
You're
it will have
right.
gone through
Without
another
a trace of us.
evolution and reforestation, and there'll be another species. And our story will be told of the extinct humans who heated the planet out into extinction. So I think it's us who are in trouble. The planet is absolutely fine. So it's our behaviors as well that has to be critical. So we don't have to always focus on the finance element. The finance is very, very critical, but I think there's plenty of things we can do from a livelihood perspective, from a consumption perspective, that need no resources. It just needs our own personal, our own human cost and ability to bear those costs in terms of time or just choices we make.
Well, and maybe as we sort of begin to kind of wrap up, I can ask you just if there's any other words about maybe, even as, finance is not everything, are there any other effective channels we can speak about and any risks we need to be thinking about, whether it's, I don't know, these things that we don't like to speak of, greed and elitism and all of that. Anything in that direction?
So I think, first of all, it's just to say that we have to make climate finance reach where the people are. I think for me, that's probably the most important thing. We have to localize it. We have to make sure it is accessible to both women. We have to make it gender responsive. We have to make it accessible. And I think for me, that's the most critical bit. And the world will be going to Glasgow in November in the COP26. And I think for me, some of the issues that have to be discussed is how to do the reforms within the global climate financing so that actually finance flows, not only to African countries, but it leaves the national level and goes to the local level and is accessible to communities. And most of them has to be grants. So I think for me, that's important. The second element then, I think it's about the need for us as human beings to shift away from what I call the greed capitalism. And greed capitalism is wanting to be a billionaire at all costs. So at the cost of other human beings, at the cost of the planet, at the cost of everything really. It's I, me, and myself. So the individualism that has been promoted by greed capitalism. And I think capitalism gets a very bad rap. It's greed that's a problem. Capitalism is fine. It's a greed that is a problem. If we got green capitalism that lives alongside socialism or socialist or collective solutions, then I think for me we will be a step ahead. So as finances come to people, it comes to entrepreneurs, then the choice has to be made that we will invest this money in climate sustaining, in climate regenerating interventions. And I think greed is what makes us greenwash planet harmful interventions. If you're doing monocropping, even if you throw the word regenerative there, even if you throw the word sustainable, it is not sustainable. It is not regenerative. If we use a lot of pesticides and herbicides on our farms and everything else, you can label it everything else to get climate financing. It is not planet friendly. If we are harming other lives, we're not climate sustainable. So I think for me, the important thing is that yes, we can talk about finances reaching the people, but the challenge also is to the people also to make decisions that are climate just, that promote the climate sustainability, as opposed to greenwashing planet harmful
That's a
human
totally
activity.
new term for me, greenwashing. I've never, I've definitely learned that today, and a lot of other things. And I think this was just the perfect way to begin today, the second day. I think you've taken some really complex themes and you've just broken them down really simply and really elegantly. And this opens the whole day to a whole bunch of other wonderful panels and discussions on this really, really great foundation. So thank you.
Thank you, Judy, for having me. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.